She was born into a world already torn at its seams. In the waning years of the 11th century, Europe was a continent in convulsion, rattled by papal decrees, dynastic wars, and the tightening grip of divine right. When Adelaide of Rheinfelden first opened her eyes, it was not to lullabies or peaceful courts, but to the hushed murmurs of discontent and the clang of swords behind heavy castle walls. Her father, Rudolf of Rheinfelden, was no ordinary noble. He was a man who dared to oppose an emperor, Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire, and paid dearly for it. In this defiant lineage, Adelaide was both privilege and liability, princess and pawn. From her earliest years, she was groomed not for freedom, but for function. Her father, embroiled in the investiture controversy, stood at odds with the emperor in a struggle that blurred the lines between church and state, sin and sovereignty. For Adelaide, this meant learning diplomacy before she learned music, absorbing the tenets of canon law alongside her catechism. She was not merely taught to sow and kneel, she was taught to survive. Her tutors spoke in veiled warnings. Her governesses always looked over their shoulders. She grew up within the somber gray halls of political rebellion, where prayers doubled as strategy and loyalty was currency. As a child, Adelaide heard more of Rome than of fairy tales. Her father's rebellion was sanctioned by Pope Gregory VII, and that papal blessing bathed her house in a dangerous holiness. At night, when other noble children dreamt of chivalric knights and pastoral peace, Adelaide dreamt of burning cities, of excommunication, of secret councils held by candlelight. She grew tall and pale, with eyes that held storms. There was nothing passive in her, nothing soft in the way she moved through the cold halls of her family's stronghold. She was the daughter of a man who had declared himself king against an emperor. And though her station brought silks and sermons, she wore them like armor. As she reached womanhood, her fate became entangled in one of the most consequential political gambits of her time. With her father's position crumbling, alliances were needed like breath. And across the mountains, in the rising kingdom of Hungary, sat an ambitious young warrior named Ladislaus. He was not yet a saint, but he bore the scent of greatness. Tall, just, and fiercely devout, he had seized the Hungarian throne after years of civil strife. His vision for Hungary was bold, a Christian kingdom rooted in order, law, and divine providence, but he needed legitimacy beyond the sword. He needed ties to the West, to noble blood that could bridge his crown to the European elite. So the match was proposed. Adelaide of Rheinfelden, daughter of a rebel king, would be offered in marriage to Ladislaus of Hungary. It was, in many eyes, a strange union, a woman born of rebellion, offered to a man building a holy order. But beneath that contradiction lay a strategic brilliance. By marrying Adelaide, Ladislaus would draw closer to the papacy and Germany's nobility, gaining a foothold in the politics of the empire that often dismissed Hungary as a rugged, uncultured periphery. For Adelaide, it was a way out. Out of a court that had lost its war. Out of a name now tainted by defeat. Out of the shadows of a father who had gambled with God and lost. She did not resist, perhaps because she understood the stakes, or perhaps because defiance was already bred out of her. But as her carriage rolled eastward across the Alps, toward a kingdom she had never seen, Adelaide carried more than trunks of linen and family crests. She carried the memory of a failed rebellion, the pride of a lineage that would not bend, and the quiet, unspoken vow that her life, whatever it would become, would not be dictated by men alone. The journey was long and unforgiving. The roads from Swabia to Pannonia were treacherous, winding through forests heavy with mist and towns that whispered of foreign gods. The Hungarian language was a mystery to her, a tongue of sharp consonants and deeper secrets. But Adelaide did not fear the unknown. She had grown up fearing what was known: betrayal, power, and the cruel indifference of fate. The unknown was, if anything, a lesser terror. When she finally arrived in Esztergom, the Hungarian capital, she was met not with fanfare but with scrutiny. The court of Ladislaus was not one of idle decadence. It was a court of soldiers and bishops, of men forged by war and sanctified by prayer. She stood among them like a white flame, alien, unbending, the queen to be with a pedigree of political fire, stepping into a kingdom aching for divine order. There were whispers. Some questioned her loyalty, her bloodline, her right to stand beside a king who sought sainthood. But Adelaide, as always, listened without reply. She had learned in her father's court that silence was a form of strength. The wedding was held in the great cathedral, beneath high Gothic arches that caught the sun like halos. Ladislaus stood beside her, a man carved from faith and fury, whose eyes held both judgment and grace. He took her hand with solemnity, and she did not flinch. Their vows were spoken not just to each other, but to Europe itself, a signal sent westward and heavenward, that Hungary had entered the holy fold, that Ladislaus would rule not just by right of conquest, but by union with a woman who carried both noble blood and the burden of a fallen cause. In the months that followed, Adelaide moved quietly through the Hungarian court. She did not claim power. She observed it. She sat beside her husband during audiences but rarely spoke. She rode through villages not in splendor, but in humility. The people came to see her not as a foreign princess, but as a symbol of hope. A woman of the West who embraced the East. A queen who did not command, but understood. Behind closed doors, Adelaide began to influence policy, not through decrees or edicts, but through questions, suggestions, reflections drawn from her childhood in Germany. She spoke of how the Church could unify kingdoms, how law could be sanctified, how rebellion could be prevented not through fear but through justice. She was not a firebrand like her father. She was a flame controlled, illuminating rather than scorching. Slowly, Ladislaus came to see in her not just a wife, but a mirror to his highest ambitions. But ambition in Hungary was never safe. The kingdom remained a fragile mosaic of tribes, feudal lords, and restless borders. Adelaide watched as her husband prepared for wars he could not avoid. She began to build her own quiet defenses, not of stone or steel, but of faith and charity. She supported monasteries, funded hospitals, and organized aid for the poor, not out of vanity, but because she knew that the people remembered the hand that fed them more than the sword that defended them. Adelaide of Rheinfelden had crossed a continent to become queen of a kingdom still unsure of its place in the world. But she had brought with her something Hungary did not know it needed, a woman forged by rebellion, shaped by faith, and determined to prove that influence did not require a crown to shine. Her name was no longer whispered in defiance. It was now spoken in reverence. The queen who came from the ashes of civil war. The bride who would help forge a saint. And thus, the first act of her quiet reign began, not with thunder, but with the steady, unfaltering rhythm of grace. The winds that swept across the Carpathian Basin carried with them the scent of early spring, mingling the damp earth of Hungary with the soft decay of melting snow. In Esztergom, where the Danube wound its eternal course past the cathedral spires and stone battlements, the court of King Ladislaus moved in slow, sacred preparation. Adelaide, now Queen of Hungary in all but name, found herself not only in a foreign land but at the heart of a monarchy yearning for sanctification. The court murmured in Latin, Old Hungarian, and a dozen dialects of the steppe. But the message was the same: this marriage was more than alliance. It was transformation. The wedding, scheduled for late spring, was planned not as a display of opulence but as a declaration of divine order. Hungary had seen decades of turmoil, usurpers, fratricide, invasions. The people hungered for peace. But more than peace, they desired meaning. In Ladislaus, they saw a warrior king who knelt before the cross as readily as he took up the sword. In Adelaide, they saw the West itself crossing into their world. The daughter of a rebel, now the wife of a redeemer. The symbolism was not lost on the bishops who presided, nor on the nobles who lined the nave of the great cathedral like sentinels of tradition. Adelaide's procession to the altar was not grand in size, but in gravity. She wore white, not in innocence, but in clarity, a symbol of rebirth, of the crossing from one world into another. Her veil was trimmed in gold filigree gifted by German abbots sympathetic to her father's cause. Yet her eyes did not waver. She walked not as a bride being offered, but as a sovereign being joined. Her steps echoed against the stone floor, a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the very bones of the kingdom. When she stood beside Ladislaus, she did not bow. She met him at eye level. Two monarchs, not one above the other. The ceremony bound them in matrimony, but it also wove together histories, geographies, and ideologies. The Pope had sent his blessing. The German princes sent token gifts. But what truly mattered was the silence that fell over the court as their vows were spoken. Words carried less weight than the stillness that followed. It was as if the air itself had bent to witness something long prophesied and now made flesh. The warrior king and the daughter of discord, united not just in union, but in purpose. After the ceremony, there were no lavish feasts nor tournaments of pageantry. Instead, Ladislaus and Adelaide withdrew quietly to the royal residence, where their first days as husband and wife unfolded in the solitude of shared duty. There was no recorded proclamation, no royal edict bearing her signature. But those who served in the court began to notice subtle changes. The rhythm of the palace altered. Adelaide's presence, precise, quiet, and keen, began to pulse beneath the surface of everyday governance. She walked the halls of the palace not as a guest but as one mapping its soul. She lingered in the scriptoria, learning how Hungarian clerics documented law and scripture. She listened during meetings of the Privy Council, observing the tensions between old tribal customs and the emerging structure of feudal law. She visited churches and monasteries, not with grandeur, but with questions. She asked about land rights, inheritance laws, the treatment of orphans, and the role of abbesses in the rural provinces. To many, she was merely curious. To the wise, she was preparing. In the months that followed, Adelaide became a force not through assertion, but through alignment. She aligned herself with the reformist elements of the church, those who sought to cleanse corruption and strengthen ecclesiastical influence. She aligned with the wives of Hungarian nobles, not as a peer, but as a patron of their concerns. She spoke in whispers, in gifts, in visits to the sick and the orphaned. In a court shaped by conquest, she introduced the slow, enduring architecture of influence. But Adelaide was not naive. She knew her position was precarious. The memory of her father's rebellion still clung to her like a shadow. Some lords whispered that she brought imperial ambition through the back door. Others suspected that her devotion to the church masked a deeper political agenda. Even among her ladies-in-waiting, there were rumors of secret letters, of coded prayers, of alliances stretching westward beyond the mountains. Yet Adelaide gave them no cause. She moved through scandal as through water, untouched. Her greatest challenge came not from the court, but from the land itself. Hungary was vast, uneven, and ethnically complex. Beyond the castles and churches of Esztergom stretched regions only loosely tethered to the crown, forests ruled by warlords, plains haunted by pagan rituals, and borderlands teeming with raiders and heretics. Adelaide understood that Ladislaus could not civilize a kingdom by force alone. Hearts had to be won as surely as lands had to be held. And so, she began a quiet campaign of cultural integration. She brought scribes from Germany to teach writing in both Latin and the vernacular. She encouraged the education of noble daughters, insisting that future queens must read scripture, understand law, and wield influence with more than beauty. She hosted small gatherings of theologians and poets, using conversation to bridge the chasms between Western Christianity and Eastern tradition. Her salons were never grand, but always purposeful. Ideas passed through her hands like relics, each chosen with care, each intended to shape the soul of a kingdom. And yet, despite her work, Adelaide never sought recognition. She declined portraits, refused statues, and turned away from ceremonies in her honor. She believed that a queen's power should be invisible, like a foundation beneath a cathedral. It should bear weight, not seek glory. Her ambition was not to be remembered, but to ensure that Hungary would be. Within Ladislaus, she found a partner of rare compatibility. He, too, craved not the trappings of kingship, but its meaning. In her, he found not just a companion but a conscience. Their private time, though scant, was filled with discourse, not of romance, but of legacy. They spoke of laws, of justice, of the dangers of hereditary pride. They feared the rot that came when kingdoms forgot the poor and worshipped only power. They planned reforms not for popularity, but for posterity. Over time, the people came to see Adelaide not just as the queen consort, but as the moral compass of the realm. Widows and mothers sent letters to her chapel. Monks prayed for her guidance. Orphans named their daughters after her. Still, she remained distant, not cold, but elevated, an image of virtue rather than intimacy. In the stories whispered among the hearths and under the cloisters, she became something more than human. A presence, a silent shield. And so, the union of Ladislaus and Adelaide became more than marriage. It became myth, a king forged in war and righteousness, a queen sculpted from exile and silence. Together, they embodied a Hungary that was still in the making, a nation born not just from bloodlines, but from belief. Their wedding had not only united two individuals, but had set into motion a redefinition of the kingdom itself. It was, in every way that mattered, more than a union, it was a covenant. The peace that followed Adelaide's wedding was not a peace forged in stone, but in sand, fragile, shifting, always on the verge of erosion. For all the solemnity of her marriage to Ladislaus and the symbolic unity it represented, the Kingdom of Hungary remained fractured beneath its veneer of Christian kingship. The specter of rebellion still loomed, and the wounds of civil war had not yet closed. Old tribal loyalties, foreign ambitions, and ecclesiastical power struggles carved invisible lines through the royal court. Even the crown itself, though settled upon Ladislaus's brow, was a contested object, tarnished by decades of usurpation and bloodshed. Hungary had seen 3 kings within a decade. Solomon, a cousin of Ladislaus, had been deposed after a bitter family conflict that left nobles divided and borders unstable. Though Ladislaus now ruled with the church's blessing and popular acclaim, his hold on the throne was far from secure. In distant fortresses and among exiled factions, Solomon still plotted his return, bolstered by allies in Austria and Bohemia. For Adelaide, barely acclimated to her new role as queen, the uncertainty was a familiar ache, one she had known in the crumbling halls of her father's doomed rebellion. But this time, she was not the daughter of dissent. She was the queen of a kingdom balancing on the edge of renewal or relapse. And in that tension, she found her purpose. Adelaide's first response to the crisis was not to speak, but to observe. She watched the court not as a monarch, but as a strategist. She learned the allegiances of noble houses, who leaned toward the old regime, who whispered of the emperor in the west, who bowed too deeply to Rome and too little to Hungary. She listened at convents, where the prayers of nuns often echoed the fears of peasantry. She visited the kitchens, the infirmaries, the stables, not out of charity, but reconnaissance. There, among servants and stewards, she heard the murmurs of the kingdom, not just political discontent, but economic strain, cultural alienation, and spiritual confusion. She came to understand that Hungary was not only politically unstable, it was existentially fractured. A kingdom once rooted in tribal traditions now struggled to adopt Christian unity. Germanic and Slavic settlements coexisted uneasily with Magyar chieftains. Roman Catholicism, still new to many, vied with ancestral beliefs that persisted in the shadows. The conversion of Hungary had not yet reached its soul. And so, Adelaide saw her mission not as a ruler enforcing order, but as a guide stitching together an identity that had yet to be fully imagined. Her first quiet act of statecraft was religious, not regal. She began to visit abbeys on the kingdom's periphery, small, weather-beaten places where monks still translated Latin into vernacular tongues by candlelight. She funded repairs without fanfare. She donated relics from her family's collection, ensuring their holy aura cast legitimacy across the realm. In one remote monastery near Transylvania, she established a scriptorium that would, over time, become the source of the earliest Hungarian religious texts that would help codify not just Christian doctrine, but a uniquely Hungarian expression of faith. Adelaide's second campaign was among the women of the realm. She understood that while kings commanded armies, queens could command generations. In the wives and daughters of nobles, she saw not idle decoration, but untapped influence. She created a network, informal, intimate, of female education and devotion. Noble women began to gather under her patronage to read scripture, discuss church teachings, and learn rudimentary governance. What began as piety became political. These women returned to their castles not just as consorts, but as advocates for unity, discipline, and allegiance to the crown. It was through these noblewomen that Adelaide subtly diffused the cult of Ladislaus. Stories of his justice, his humility, and his devotion began to circulate beyond court chronicles. Tales of him sparing enemy soldiers, of fasting before battle, of kneeling in snow to pray, whether literal or embellished, took root in the minds of the people. But those stories did not spread on their own. They traveled by hearth and cradle, carried by mothers who now saw their role not only in childbirth, but in statecraft. And behind that awakening stood Adelaide, weaving a fabric of reverence one thread at a time. But even as she worked to heal the soul of the kingdom, war returned to its body. In the early 1080s, Solomon re-emerged with force, allied with the emperor and some discontented lords. He launched incursions along Hungary's western frontier. It was not yet a full-scale war, but it was a test of Ladislaus's reign. Troops were mustered, castles fortified, nobles summoned, and Adelaide, though not clad in armor, prepared for her own campaign. She transformed parts of the royal palace into medical wards. She summoned apothecaries, midwives, and herbalists, creating what would later be seen as one of Hungary's first organized systems of wartime care. She ordered inventories of grain and wine, rerouting supplies to regions likely to face siege. She arranged for priests and monks to accompany soldiers, not only to hear confessions, but to write records, preserving the truth of the conflict against later distortion. She also reached beyond the realm, through letters written in her hand and sealed with her private crest. She contacted bishops in Swabia and Burgundy, calling upon their loyalty not to a crown, but to the shared mission of Christendom. These were not cries for aid, but arguments for Hungary's role as a bulwark of Christian order on the edge of Europe. And in her words, there was no desperation, only conviction. Ladislaus met Solomon in a series of engagements that tested both faith and resolve. Though battle was inevitable, the goal was not annihilation, but legitimacy. Solomon, though defeated, was not executed. He was imprisoned with dignity. And in that decision, many saw the hand of Adelaide. Mercy was the queen's doctrine. Even in war, it was a mercy rooted not in weakness, but in vision, a vision of a Hungary not defined by vengeance, but by virtue. When peace returned, the scars of conflict remained. Villages lay burnt, fields went untilled, widows and orphans multiplied. It was in this aftermath that Adelaide's influence deepened. She launched a program, unofficial, unrecorded, of restitution. Lands confiscated during the rebellion were partially restored to families loyal to the crown. Widows were given stipends from the royal treasury. Children were sent to monasteries or convents to be educated under the queen's supervision. These acts, small in appearance, built a foundation of loyalty that would long outlast the war itself. By the late 1080s, Adelaide was no longer merely a queen in name. She had become, in the eyes of many, the moral heart of the realm. Not a co-ruler, but a conscience. Not a strategist of politics, but of permanence. Her role had no title, no coronation, no legal framework, but it was real. It lived in the decisions of village elders, in the reforms whispered by bishops, in the prayers of mothers who now believed their children might grow in a Hungary where law was not the enemy of love. And yet, Adelaide remained ever vigilant. She knew that peace was never final. That ambition slept only lightly. The threats to Hungary would not cease, nor would the fractures within its soul heal in a single generation. But she had given the kingdom something it had never known before, not just a queen, but a keeper, not of power, but of promise. By the turn of the 1090s, Hungary no longer stood on the margins of Christendom. It had become, in the eyes of many, a frontier kingdom, one foot planted in the steppes of the east, the other reaching westward toward the high altars of Rome. Yet for all its martial strength and legislative reform, the soul of Hungary was still being shaped. The sword could claim land, and law could command obedience, but only the church could sanctify a crown. And it was in this invisible terrain of faith and diplomacy that Adelaide moved with quiet precision, stitching Hungary into the spiritual map of Europe with hands neither crowned nor armored. While Ladislaus ruled with justice and religious fervor, it was Adelaide who understood the language of Rome. She had grown up among bishops and abbots, her father once a papal champion against imperial overreach. She knew the pulse of ecclesiastical politics, the jealousies between dioceses, the ambitions of cardinals who wielded influence as surely as kings. More importantly, she understood that in an age where salvation and sovereignty were intertwined, a queen's voice, if rightly placed, could echo louder in the cloisters of Europe than on its battlefields. Her diplomacy did not begin with grand embassies or papal bulls. It began, as always, In silence, she wrote letters, measured, theological, laced with deference and subtle assertion. To abbots in Cluny, she praised monastic reform while subtly drawing parallels with Ladislaus's codification of justice. To bishops in Mainz and Trier, she spoke of Hungary not as a backwater but as a defender of the Western Rite amid pagan borders. Her words did not beg approval, they offered alignment. She did not ask Rome to see Hungary as worthy, she reminded them that it already was. These letters became more than correspondence. They became a narrative, carefully built and deliberately spread. Hungary as a beacon of Christian virtue. Ladislaus as a just king blessed with divine favor. And Adelaide as the bridge that bound east to west in holy concord. And though the Vatican had yet to canonize any Hungarian king, murmurs began to circulate among the clergy. They spoke of Ladislaus's piety, of his restraint in war, of his queen's ecclesiastical sensibilities. The soil was being prepared, not for power, but for legacy. Back within the Hungarian court, Adelaide's influence extended beyond parchment. She helped establish ecclesiastical schools, ensuring the next generation of priests and scribes were not only devout but literate in the languages of diplomacy, Latin, German, and the evolving Hungarian vernacular. She invited Benedictine scholars from her homeland, not to dominate, but to harmonize. They brought with them liturgical knowledge, legal codices, and theological commentaries, all of which enriched the intellectual life of Hungary's fledgling institutions. Perhaps her most strategic act was the quiet elevation of Hungarian saints. Adelaide knew that sainthood did not emerge from miracles alone, it required witnesses, documents, and promotion. She began gathering accounts of the life of Stephen I, Hungary's first king and founder of its Christian identity. She encouraged the collection of relics, the standardization of his vitae, and the embellishment of his narrative. These efforts laid the foundation for Stephen's eventual canonization, an event that would validate Hungary's divine right to rule and place it among the sanctified nations of Europe. But Adelaide's attention was not confined to internal sanctification. She understood that the empire to the west, fractured though it was, still viewed Hungary with suspicion. Old alliances had frayed, and the memory of her father's rebellion lingered like incense, sweet to the faithful, noxious to emperors. To counter this, she engaged in a form of cultural diplomacy rarely recognized in her time. She sent manuscripts, icons, and gifts to select courts, not as bribes, but as signals. Each item bore Hungary's craftsmanship, its theological maturity, its spiritual depth. They were objects of devotion, but also of strategy, tokens that whispered of civilization where others saw frontier. These gestures found their mark. In German monasteries, monks began to pray for Hungary's royal family. In northern Italy, travelers carried stories of a queen who funded hospitals, who refused to wear jewels in Lent, who translated psalms by candlelight. In France, scholars took interest in Hungary's legal codes, noting their alignment with Roman precedent and Christian ethics. Hungary, once dismissed as barbaric, was being rewritten in the European imagination. And Adelaide, though never mentioned in charters or titles, was its author. Her relationship with the papacy deepened as well. She maintained a delicate balance, never presuming authority, yet never ceding Hungary's sovereignty to Rome's caprice. She argued, subtly, for Hungarian bishops to be appointed from within, for the crown to retain investiture rights without excommunication. These were dangerous positions, echoing the same tensions that had consumed her father's life. But Adelaide did not confront. She persuaded. She wrapped policy in piety, autonomy in reverence, and in doing so, she carved out for Hungary a rare space, faithful, but not subservient. Throughout these years, her public appearances were sparse but symbolically potent. She walked barefoot through plague-struck villages. She fasted on feast days. She held the hands of lepers without fear. In a world where queens were often draped in brocade and isolation, Adelaide stood among the afflicted like a servant of God. It was not performance. It was theology made flesh. And it struck deep into the hearts of her people, who began to speak of their queen not as noble, but as holy. At the same time, Ladislaus's reign became increasingly revered. He expanded the kingdom's borders, secured trade routes, and enforced laws with fairness uncommon for the age. But he did so, always, with a conscience shaped in part by Adelaide. Their evenings, when not divided by war or council, were filled with scripture and discussion. They debated Augustine, consulted monastic letters, and prayed together, not as ritual, but as governance. Theirs was a union of minds as much as crowns. Toward the end of the decade, Adelaide turned her attention to succession. With no male heir yet born, the question of inheritance loomed. Rather than panic or politicize, she laid the groundwork for spiritual continuity. She ensured that the monasteries she founded would endure beyond her life. She tasked scribes with compiling chronicles that emphasized the divine nature of Hungary's kingship. She began to speak in metaphors of vineyards and seasons, of planting seeds whose fruit she would never see. It was a slow relinquishing of control, a preparation for legacy over presence. And though the Church in Rome had yet to canonize Ladislaus, or even acknowledge Hungary as fully integrated, Adelaide knew the process had begun. It would take decades, perhaps longer, but the path had been cleared. The world would remember her husband as more than a king, and in time, they would remember her not by name, but by the holiness she left behind in silence. In parchment, in stone, her faith was never loud. Her diplomacy never boasted, but in a world ruled by war and whispered by monks, Adelaide's voice carried further than most ever knew. She had become the soul of Hungary's sanctity, the unseen architect of a spiritual realm, binding heaven and kingdom with hands the world rarely saw. The peace Adelaide had helped cultivate across Hungary in the previous decade, however delicate, could not last forever. Like the turning of the seasons or the rising of floodwaters, conflict in medieval Europe was inevitable. It came not from one front, but from many, slow-moving, insidious, creeping into the corners of Ladislaus's kingdom like shadows at dusk. And with it came the test of everything Adelaide had labored to build, not only the unity of the realm, but the soul of a people. It began in whispers from the eastern frontier. The Pechenegs, nomadic warriors hardened by generations of steppe warfare, began to press once more against the borders of Hungary. Raiders swept into villages, burning crops, capturing hostages, testing the limits of royal defense. They were not a kingdom, not a people to be reasoned with, but a force of nature, chaotic, violent, and unrepentant. Their incursions were not invasions in the traditional sense, but warnings. The wilderness still waited beyond the cross, and it remembered. Ladislaus, seasoned by a lifetime of warfare, moved quickly to respond. Garrisons were reinforced, scouts sent into the forests. Alliances with frontier lords were tightened. Yet beneath the visible measures, Adelaide felt the deeper tremor. This was not simply a military threat, it was a crisis of purpose. Hungary's identity as a Christian kingdom had been forged in fire, but its foundation was still tender. A prolonged conflict would not only weaken its defenses, but erode its fragile unity. In court, the pressure mounted. Nobles argued over resources. Bishops debated whether war could still be called holy. The treasury grew thin, and famine followed a bitter winter. As the king prepared for war, Adelaide once again turned to the people, not to raise armies, but to reinforce resolve. She reopened the infirmaries she had built a decade earlier. Monasteries were tasked with stockpiling grain, not for clergy, but for civilians caught in the path of conflict. She wrote again to the West, not for soldiers, but for scholars, asking for missives and texts that spoke of righteous endurance and divine justice. These were not requests made in desperation. They were reminders that Hungary was not alone, that its suffering was a shared burden of Christendom. But as the specter of invasion loomed, Adelaide faced another, quieter crisis: succession. Ladislaus had no surviving son. Years of campaign and court had wearied his body, and time was no longer a distant threat. The question of who would rule after him became inescapable. Factions formed. Some looked to Almos, Ladislaus's nephew, while others feared the return of Solomon's claim. The uncertainty bred tension, and though Adelaide had never sought to interfere in dynastic disputes, she understood better than anyone that the crown, once vacated, was rarely claimed without blood. So, in the shadows of war, Adelaide moved to secure a different kind of peace. She invited Almos to court, not in public ceremony, but in quiet audiences. She studied his manner, his faith, his appetite for power. She met with bishops, urging them to prepare the people for a smooth transition. In the royal chapels, prayers for future wisdom, began to echo beside those for present strength. She also turned to the women once again, the noblewomen whose families would determine the next king by sword or oath. She reminded them of the cost of civil war, of sons buried and lands burned. She offered not bribes, but promises, stability, continuity, and the preservation of what they had built together. Her influence was not command, but conviction. Outside the palace walls, Ladislaus led his men into skirmishes that slowed, but did not stop. The incursions. There were victories, decisive, courageous, but no final triumph. The Pechenegs retreated like wind, only to return weeks later. The frontier was a bleeding wound. And with each campaign, Ladislaus returned more fatigued, his armor heavier, his gaze more distant. At night, Adelaide would sit beside him in the royal chambers, reading to him from Psalms, or simply watching the rise and fall of his breath. She had known from the beginning that greatness often came with suffering. But now, watching the man she had helped mold into a legend fade before her eyes, she understood something deeper, that legacies were not written in victories alone, but in endurance. She began to prepare the kingdom for a future without Ladislaus, not as a declaration of doom, but as an act of faith. She commissioned chroniclers to write not just of battles, but of laws enacted, of churches built, of widows fed. She worked with abbots to preserve the records of Ladislaus's reign, accounts that would outlast politics and pass into liturgy. In the candlelit quiet of her own chambers, she began assembling her own account, not of herself, but of the ideals that had guided their rule. And then, as if summoned by the weight of it all, illness came, not to her, but to Ladislaus. It began as a fever. He concealed it at first, dismissing it as fatigue, but soon the signs were undeniable. Tremors in his hands, the hollowness beneath his eyes, the way he leaned more on his aids when walking. Physicians came, offering prayers and poultices. Monks knelt in vigils. Adelaide, ever composed, took charge. She limited access to the king's chambers, shielding him from court chaos. She summoned relics from distant monasteries. She fasted, prayed, wept only in solitude. The kingdom waited. Borders still burned, enemies still prowled, but within the palace, time seemed suspended. Days were measured not in sunlight, but in pulses and whispered diagnoses. For Adelaide, every breath Ladislaus took was a petition to heaven. Yet even in sickness, Ladislaus remained a king. When he could, he dictated, he gave orders, not for war, but for peace. That almos be supported, that land grants be protected, that churches continue to receive royal patronage. And always at his side was Adelaide, writing when his hands could not, deciding when his strength failed, never speaking of death, but always preparing for it. She refused to let his reign dissolve into sorrow. She brought choirs into the palace chapel. She lit candles each night at the altar of Saint Stephen. She ordered the cathedral bells rung not in mourning, but in thanksgiving, for what had been, and for what could still be. And when the moment finally came, when the king who had brought order to chaos, who had lived as a sword and knelt as a saint, took his last breath, it was in Adelaide's presence, her hand in his, her prayer the last sound he heard. The shadow of war still lingered beyond the walls. The future of the crown was not yet secure. But in that chamber, in that moment, something eternal passed, not just the soul of a king, but the soul of an era. And Adelaide, though cloaked in grief, did not collapse. She rose. She ordered the court to gather. She addressed the bishops, the nobles, the servants. She spoke not of death, but of duty, of carrying forward the light that Ladislaus had kindled. Her voice was calm, her eyes unblinking, and in her bearing, the court saw not a widow, but a steward of legacy. The queen who had once arrived as a stranger, the woman born from rebellion and silence, the sovereign who had guided a kingdom through sanctity, diplomacy, and war, now stood at the threshold of history, holding in her hands the burden and beauty of all that had come before. And though the kingdom grieved, it did not crumble, because Adelaide still stood. The death of a king, even one beloved, does not stop the turning of the world. It does not delay the rising of the sun, nor does it silence the breath of a kingdom still alive with trade, hunger, prayer, and war. Yet in Esztergom, in the shadow of Ladislaus's passing, time slowed. Bells tolled not only for a sovereign, but for a chapter in the life of Hungary that had reshaped its identity. And at the heart of this quiet fracture stood Adelaide, not only as the widow of a sainted king, but as the living vessel of all that he had left behind. She did not retreat, not into silence, nor into cloister. Many expected her to disappear from court, to let the male powers of inheritance and politics resume their natural course. But Adelaide, even in grief, did not surrender to custom. She remained in the palace not to rule, but to guide, not to challenge succession, but to preserve memory. Her voice no longer spoke in matters of law or diplomacy. Instead, it carried through liturgy, architecture, and the fragile weight of remembrance. The sanctity that Ladislaus had earned in life did not cease with death, it intensified. Stories spread like wildfire. Peasants swore he had cured the sick with a touch. Soldiers claimed he had walked unscathed through a burning village. Priests spoke of visions at his tomb, of incorrupt relics, of birds gathering on the roof of the chapel during his funeral mass. Whether true or imagined, the myth of Ladislaus bloomed in every corner of the land. And Adelaide, more than anyone, understood that sainthood was not born only of miracles, it required structure, documentation, devotion, continuity. She gathered scribes, monks, and witnesses. She established a committee, not formalized by the church, but revered nonetheless, to compile a vita of Ladislaus. She made certain that the stories were recorded faithfully, that the justice and humility of his reign were inscribed not as legend, but as legacy. She was not canonizing him in Rome. She was canonizing him in Hungary's soul. She also understood the risk that sainthood could bring. Reverence for the dead king might eclipse loyalty to the living crown. There were murmurs already, some nobles unwilling to pledge allegiance to Almos or the royal council, choosing instead to defer to the will of Ladislaus, as interpreted through dreams, visions, or forged letters. It was a dangerous cult, born from love but prone to fracture. So Adelaide moved delicately. She discouraged fanatics, redirected enthusiasm into public works, and worked closely with bishops to ensure that the church guided devotion, not the mob. In parallel, she turned inward, not to abandon the world, but to commune with it more deeply. She began waking before dawn to attend prayers with the monks. She walked the palace gardens barefoot in winter, meditating on suffering. She fasted more than required, gave away her jewelry, and wore only simple linen veils even during court observances. Her piety, already known, now became undeniable. She had not only lost a husband, she had transformed grief into ritual. And in doing so, she became something more than a queen. She became a relic of the living. And yet suffering, for Adelaide, was not confined to loss. It was also memory. She began to reflect more deeply on the early days of her life, the rebellion of her father, the exile, the suspicion that clung to her as a foreigner. Those ghosts never fully departed. They stirred now, in her solitude, as if seeking forgiveness. Adelaide, who had long labored for unity, now faced the fragmentation within her own soul. She wrote letters, though she had no one to send them to, letters to her father, asking if he would be proud. Letters to Ladislaus, asking if she had honored his wishes. Letters to God, questioning if silence had been her greatest virtue or her greatest failing. These writings, never meant for eyes beyond her own, became the final mirror of her life. And through them, she came to understand that her suffering was not a burden, but a form of sanctity. It allowed her to carry the sorrow of others, to become the queen not of power, but of pain made holy. She began funding hospices in the provinces, places where the dying could be comforted, where the mentally ill would not be hidden, but cared for. She insisted that every village church have a fund for widows and orphans, overseen not by nobles, but by abbesses. She ordered new roads built not to castles, but to monasteries, making pilgrimage possible for those who had nothing but hope. These were not policies of a ruler. They were devotions, rituals, echoes of a woman who had turned her own mourning into liturgy. As the cult of Ladislaus grew, so too did Adelaide's transformation. Pilgrims began arriving in Esztergom not only to pray at the king's tomb, but to glimpse the woman who had stood beside him. They brought gifts, bread, coins, embroidered shawls. They left offerings outside her chamber door, carved crosses, tiny candles, dried herbs. They whispered her name in the same breath as saints. She did not seek this. She accepted it with humility, knowing that her task was not to absorb their reverence, but to reflect it back toward the divine. But still, the line blurred. Paintings began to appear, crude at first, later more refined, depicting her beside Ladislaus in halos of light. In one, she wept over his body with a golden aureole around her head. In another, she held a parchment bearing the laws of his reign, as if delivering them to the heavens. None of these were commissioned by her, yet she did not destroy them. In her final years within the palace, Adelaide slowly relinquished her worldly routines. She stopped attending court sessions. Even as an observer, she declined to weigh in on noble disputes. Citing prayer, she slept on a wooden cot rather than a feather bed, surrounded by psalters and relics. Her meals were silent, her words fewer, and yet, her presence was more powerful than ever. Nobles still consulted her, bishops deferred to her wisdom. Even almos, now ruling in Ladislaus's stead, sought her counsel, not because law required it, but because her judgment had come to represent the conscience of the realm. And then, one winter morning, she simply stopped appearing. The court waited. A day passed, then two. Finally, her chamber door opened, and a nun emerged, not weeping, not jubilant, but serene. Adelaide had not died, they said. She had withdrawn into a convent, quietly founded at the edge of Esztergom, where she would live out her final days not as a queen, but as a servant. No formal announcement was made. No procession followed her, but within a week, pilgrims redirected their paths. They followed the river not to the cathedral, but to the stone chapel beyond the city's edge. They hoped to glimpse her during Mass, to receive a blessing, to see the woman who had outlived a king and yet remained the beating heart of his memory. In her cell, Adelaide spent her days in transcription. She copied scripture by hand. She embroidered altar cloths. She prayed for peace, not only in the world, but in the hearts of those who still carried war within them. And when illness finally came for her, gentle, unhurried, like a guest who waits for permission, she met it without fear. She had lived through rebellion, exile, marriage, statecraft, widowhood, and veneration, but most of all, she had lived through herself. And in that endurance, she had found the truest form of sanctity. Not in canonization, but in suffering transformed into grace. There are rulers whose names vanish with their tombstones, and others whose influence echoes long after their final breath. Adelaide of Rheinfelden, widow of Saint Ladislaus, had never sought to rule, never craved titles or command, but in the years following the king's death, her role became more essential than ever, not as sovereign, but as steward of remembrance. Her legacy was not written in decrees or monuments, but in the subtle ways she shaped the very memory of Hungary's soul. Her retreat to the convent at the edge of Esztergom marked not an end, but a quiet transfiguration. Within those stone walls, Adelaide continued to breathe life into the kingdom's spiritual architecture. She no longer walked palace corridors or stood behind bishops in council, but her presence remained felt in every corner of the court. Her voice, though absent, was still invoked in whispers of advice, in copied manuscripts, in the rituals that had taken on her silent cadence. From her modest cell, Adelaide maintained correspondence with abbots and abbesses across Hungary. She encouraged the continuation of educational programs for women, particularly among the nobility. She sent scriptural commentaries to monasteries and provided guidance on ecclesiastical disputes when requested. Her seal, once affixed to royal missives, now graced letters written in the service of peace, clarity, and wisdom. Though she lived in simplicity, her influence had never been more refined. The convent she founded became a place of quiet pilgrimage, not only for the poor and pious, but for nobles seeking discernment. It was said that walking its halls was like walking alongside history itself. Pilgrims came not for relics or miraculous cures, but for presence, for the chance to be near the woman who had held the hand of a saint and guided a kingdom without ever raising her voice. Adelaide never claimed a spiritual title. She did not call herself abbess or saint. She refused honors, redirected gifts, and asked that her name be omitted from liturgical calendars. But those around her began to speak of her as something beyond ordinary. Her calmness in suffering, her devotion without spectacle, her clarity in the face of moral ambiguity, these became, to many, signs of divine favor. It was in this humble sanctuary that Adelaide began her final work, the shaping of legacy. She summoned a scribe, young, untested, but devout, and began to dictate. Not a memoir, nor a political defense, but a reflection on kingship, virtue, and the responsibilities of memory. It was not about Ladislaus the man, but Ladislaus the idea, the image of a ruler who had brought law where there was chaos, sanctity where there was war, and order where there had been fratricide. She spoke of his justice, not only in the courtroom but in the field, of his restraint when vengeance could have ruled, of his tears in the chapel, hidden from the eyes of generals. She described his silences, those moments before decisions, when the weight of life and death passed through him like breath through a bellows. She wanted the world to remember not only what he did, but how he bore what he could not change. The text that emerged was not grand in style, nor overly embellished. It was sparse, thoughtful, and deeply human. It was the foundation upon which, decades later, clerics would build the hagiographies that would elevate Ladislaus to sainthood. And though Adelaide's name would be buried in footnotes and prefaces, her hand shaped every sentence. She became, in essence, the first theologian of his sanctity. Outside the convent, Hungary shifted. Kings came and went. Borders swelled and shrank. Wars flared. Alliances broke. New threats emerged from east and west. But the core that Adelaide had helped forge, the moral and spiritual identity of the nation, remained. Churches continued to celebrate the rule of Ladislaus not as military triumph, but as divine example. Children were named after him. Pilgrimages to his burial site increased. And always, woven through his story, was the quiet presence of the woman who had outlived him. As Adelaide aged, her body weakened, but her mind remained sharp. She continued to rise before dawn, to attend Mass, to assist in transcriptions. She trained younger sisters in both humility and history. She insisted that they study Scripture in context, that they learn not only to pray, but to understand faith. She once wrote in the margin of a psalter, "Without memory is like a flame without air. It burns bright, but dies quickly." That line, copied by a novice, would later be repeated in monasteries across the Carpathians. Her impact stretched beyond Hungary. Through her earlier letters and alliances, she had laid foundations that would link the Hungarian church with reformist currents in France and Germany. Monks from Cluny began to visit Esztergom. Hungarian scholars were invited to scriptoria in Mainz and Reims. The intellectual and spiritual traffic she had fostered, deliberately, silently, continued to move long after she left court. In this, she had not only helped define Hungary's place in Europe, but opened the gates for future generations to do the same. And yet, even in all this, she remained resistant to being honored. When the court offered to commission a statue, she declined. When an archbishop suggested composing a hymn in her name, she refused. "Let the stone speak of God," she reportedly said, "not of those who carried it." Her humility was not performative, it was elemental, as if she had been carved from the same stillness that filled the chapels she helped consecrate. But the people remembered anyway. On the anniversary of Ladislaus's death, they lit candles not only for him, but for her. In village prayers, mothers whispered her name beside saints. Among the nobility, daughters were named not just Adela or Laslone, but simply the Queen. That single title, detached from grandeur, came to mean something deeper: devotion without demand, presence without pride, strength without spectacle. And when the time came, quietly, as always, for Adelaide to leave the world she had watched over so long, it was not with thunder or mourning, but with reverence. She died in her sleep, her hands folded over a copy of the Gospels she had copied herself. The convent bell rang once, then again, then fell silent. There was no funeral procession, no canonization, no public burial. Her body was interred beneath the convent chapel, beneath a plain stone slab with no name, only a cross and the words Pax Domini. But the silence did not erase her. In the decades that followed, chroniclers traced the path of her life in footnotes and margins. Bishops cited her letters, pilgrims asked to pray near her resting place. And the memory of Adelaide, though never exalted, remained unshakable. She had been many things: a daughter of rebellion, a foreign queen, a silent strategist, a widow, a saint-maker. But above all, she had been a guardian, not of power, not of titles, but of what they meant. And through that, she endured. Long after the last torch was extinguished in the palace of Esztergom, long after the walls that had echoed with Ladislaus's voice fell into quiet disrepair. And long after kings had come and gone, the name of Adelaide remained, not carved into the monuments of conquest or shouted from the pulpits of political ambition, but whispered softly in the chapels where old women lit candles for their sons, where monks copied psalms by hand, where silence held more power than proclamations ever could. She had never ruled in name. She had never claimed to be a saint. And yet, in the quiet centuries that followed, Adelaide of Rheinfelden came to occupy a space beyond either court or convent. She became, in the collective soul of Hungary, a figure of stillness, neither forgotten nor exalted, but gently revered. Her memory did not rise like a cathedral from stone. It moved like mist through the forests, like the hush before a blessing, like the space between prayers. In the years after her death, her convent continued to function not just as a sanctuary, but as a sanctuary of remembrance. Novices there were taught not only to transcribe scripture, but to study her example. Adelaide's rule, as they came to call it, was never written, but it was practiced. Serve before you speak, heal before you advise, remember before you judge. Her life became the curriculum. Her silence became the liturgy. The chapel where she was buried remained unmarked, as she had wished, and yet pilgrims came. They knelt before the slab etched only with Pax Domini and laid down bits of their own grief, dried flowers, children's tokens, notes folded from crumpled scraps of parchment. They did not come expecting miracles. They came because something about her refusal to seek attention, something about her deliberate fading, gave them hope. Hope that one could live a life of great meaning without ever raising one's voice above the wind. Elsewhere, in courts and churches, her name passed into a quieter form of reverence. Historians noted her contributions as influential. Theologians praised her hidden holiness. Bishops invoked her wisdom during heated debates. But always, her legacy eluded ownership. No single monastery claimed her. No dynasty exalted her as a mother of kings. She had given herself so completely to the idea of service that she became almost incorporeal in the records, a presence that shaped events without demanding credit for them. And yet, in the deepest archives of Hungarian history, beneath the layers of royal edicts and clerical records, her hand was everywhere. The codification of Christian law? It bore traces of her correspondence with Rome. The canonization of Saint Ladislaus? Built on narratives she had helped preserve. The educational rise of noblewomen? Rooted in her letters and quiet gatherings decades prior. The road systems to monasteries. The rise of hospice care. The early integration of Hungarian faith with the broader European theological tradition, all seeds she had planted. It was no accident that when later queens of Hungary sought models of virtue, it was Adelaide they studied. Not because she had ruled, but because she had endured. She had watched kingdoms collapse and quietly built something stronger, a culture, a consciousness, a way of being royal without ruling, powerful without domination, devout without sanctimony. Legends emerged, slowly. In some, she appeared to a dying child in a fevered vision, whispering a final prayer. In others, she was seen wandering the convent cloisters at night, candle in hand, murmuring blessings in 3 languages. These stories were never confirmed, never sanctioned by Rome, but they persisted, because even without miracles, Adelaide had worked one of the rarest in human history. She had made herself disappear in life, only to remain forever in memory. Centuries later, when the chronicles of Saint Ladislaus were compiled into the great illuminated manuscripts of the High Middle Ages, the scribes included a brief mention of his wife. Not long, not florid, just a few lines. She was foreign-born, but made herself mother of the kingdom. She did not speak often, but when she did, kings listened. She wore no crown in heaven's light, but all who saw her knew she had been sanctified by love and grief alike. That was all, but it was enough. In time, even her name faded from popular retelling. Her deeds were absorbed into the mythos of Hungary itself, felt, if not remembered. She became a spirit of the land, not in superstition, but in symbol, the queen who built nothing for herself, and in doing so, built everything for others. And so, Adelaide of Rheinfelden passed fully into the realm of the silent saint. Not canonized, not glorified, simply remembered, in the flicker of candlelight behind stained glass, in the quiet discipline of a young nun's hands, in the line of a law book written centuries ago, in the space between a soldier's cry and a mother's prayer. There, still, she waited. There, still, she endured. There, still, she served. And history, so often written by those who shouted, paused for a moment and listened.